What's quite cute is we both have young boys, and our boys are both 4, and they can't tell us apart. So they say that they have 2 mummies. Oh. And so when we're out in public, they'll come up to us and say, "Are you my mummy or are you my other mummy?" And people sort of look at us like that's a little strange, but I love it. We've sort of adopted each other's kids as our own, and it's amazing. A bigger family.
Welcome. This is Uncommon Sense, a CPA podcast presented by the Heshe CPA Knowledge Centre. The Centre is an initiative of the CPA Education Foundation, the charitable arm of the Chartered Professional Accountant profession in Alberta. For the record, this podcast isn't about bean counting. Our episodes feature conversations with Alberta CPAs sharing their insights on a wide range of timely topics. I'm Gordon Turtle, and on this episode, we wrap up our conversation with Maureen Moneta, CPA, community leader, corporate director, consultant, and identical twin. Maureen is also an Indigenous Albertan with strong roots in Alberta's Métis community and in Indigenous initiatives across the province. Maureen serves or has served on several boards, including the Alberta Gaming, Liquor and Cannabis Board, the CPA Alberta Board, the Edmonton Unlimited Board, and the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, as well as a private company board. She has been named a Top 40 Albertan Under 40 by Edify Edmonton magazine and has earned an Early Achievement Award from CPA Alberta. Maureen is here for part 2 of our discussion about her journey to personal and career success, her views on women and leadership, and some of the work she's been involved in to support Indigenous education and businesses in the province. If you haven't listened to part 1 of Maureen's visit with us, you might want to go back and check that one out. Thanks for joining us for round 2, Maureen.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be back.
Thanks. Let's continue from where we left off at the end of our previous discussion. I want to ask you about your ICD.D designation, which is bestowed by the Institute of Corporate Directors. From what I understand, the requirements to obtain that designation are incredibly rigorous. Talk about what it was like to earn this designation and how you have applied what you learned from that program.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm really proud to have my ICD designation. I had applied into the program several years earlier and was told that I didn't have enough experience to contribute at that time. I got great feedback on what experience I needed to gain, and I set out to get it. I'm giving up. I would tease and sometimes say I'm missing the give up gene, which has been probably a plus and a minus at times. But when I applied the second time and was accepted into the program, I was so excited. I was so excited to be a part of a cohort of professionals that were just the gold standard and top notch. And it really spoke to my value around excellence. I don't want to just be on a board. I want to be able to have the training that I need to have confidence and be able to contribute at the highest level and be a high performer in everything that I do. And so when I think about how I apply that learning, I'd say in every board meeting. In every board meeting, I think about how that practical experience that I learned in the program, how that actually translates. And why I say it that way is because the program is designed around having like mock boardrooms. And so you're going through cases, you're learning different skills, and you're doing it in a way that you're actually getting some of the practice as you go. And so when I left the program and was able to move into some other board roles that I probably wouldn't have had the opportunity to join had I not had the designation, I felt like I was ready to go.
Well, speaking of board involvement, you definitely are involved in a lot of boards. What do you think are the qualities and characteristics a person needs in order to be a successful board member and even board chair, as you're going to be soon?
Yeah, when I think about the strong board members that I've worked with, I think they're consistently intelligent, they're curious, and they're humble. To me, being a good board member is about asking good questions and being able to make insightful connections. Contributing your unique perspective is incredibly important. And so having the confidence to do that in a way that's productive is really, really important. I've not come across someone on a board who hasn't been really intelligent and hasn't had an important view to share. But I think the way in which we share our views is almost as important as the view itself. because that's what allows it to land. When I think about board chairs, and I've had the great pleasure of working with several that have been just amazing, I think about their role as a facilitator. A great board chair isn't there to have their own voice heard. They're in that role to help curate the conversation. They're helping to pull out sort of the best of all that's in the room and make sure that all the voices can be heard, because I believe fully that the best decisions are made with diverse groups when everyone is included and feels safe to contribute.
Well, and this is not a question about you, but just generally, like, do you think people can have bad experiences serving as board members? And why would that be the case, do you think?
Yes. Boards have a real opportunity to be excellent. They're the A team. The leadership of the board is incredibly important. And I'm passionate about building high-performing boards. It's not easy, though. I think the skills that we have in our executive careers are not the same skills that we necessarily need to be a good board member. And so there's a lot to learn, and being a lifelong learner certainly helps. Many people that I talk with, and I do some consulting in this space around board governance and helping boards create and move towards high performance. I think a lot of boards have opportunities to improve that sometimes they see and sometimes they don't.
So having said all that, would you recommend board involvement to others as a valuable component of career growth and success?
Absolutely. I think it's really important that if someone's considering joining a board, that they consider where they can impact and that they understand the role that they can have. When I hear people say, I want to join a board as sort of a blanket statement, I think that's really... I'm curious about that and understanding more why they want to join the board and what impact they think they can have. Being on a board is a huge responsibility that needs to be taken really seriously. But I think if people are looking to join for the right reasons, to have impact with how they can contribute their perspective, then I would encourage them to consider joining as soon as they can. There's a lot of great education programs out there that can give you the skills to understand your role and understand the processes that the board has, but people don't need to. Many do join boards at the later ends of their career as they're looking to transition to something less full-time.
When they're 62.
On average, when a board member is 62 or a person is 62, that's the average age of a board member. But it doesn't need to be that way, because the views of younger demographics are critically important. How many industries have their customer base that's made up of millennial-aged people, and how many of those same companies have millennial-aged people on their boards or on their executive teams? And it's difficult because, first and foremost, you must have the skills, the competencies, the capabilities to contribute. And a lot of folks earlier on in their careers don't necessarily have that. And so they need to be sort of out of the running for some of those roles right away. But it's not impossible. It's a less beaten path, but you can take it if you're interested.
Yeah, that's a really important point, I think. You want board members to have that experience and knowledge and wisdom and all that, but you need younger people on there as well, because that's who in most cases, the organization is serving. So really good point. I want to shift gears now, Maureen, and talk a bit about your involvement in Indigenous initiatives. You've got a distinguished record of involvement in organizations and initiatives that support Indigenous peoples, help advance Indigenous education, and grow Indigenous businesses. Why is that kind of involvement important to you?
So that involvement is important to me because there are so few Indigenous CPAs and Indigenous business leaders in some of those spaces. The last statistics I saw is that much less than 5% of executives are Indigenous people, and I think it's less than 2% are Indigenous people or are on boards. And so I realized, as I talked about being Métis and what it meant to me, that people were coming to me saying, can you help me find another Indigenous board member, another Indigenous CPA, an Indigenous executive? And these calls were starting to grow more and more because our communities and our society is expecting it. Auditors that are going into Indigenous communities, the communities are expecting that Indigenous people will be their auditors, that they understand the culture, the communities, the nuances that exist that are critically important. And so I think all levels of business and across all industries are looking to have more Indigenous people involved. But there's so many barriers that exist for Indigenous people that are unique and that don't exist for others, that this work really needs to start somewhere. And so, why am I involved? I'm involved because I don't have enough time. And the few of us that are out there, I don't think anyone is involved because they're looking to be involved necessarily in all of these different things. We see an important role that needs to be played and an important perspective that needs to be contributed, and there's not many others that are sort of there to do it. And so my hope is, with the success of the work that we're doing with CPA, is that over time I'll have less and less calls, because every time I get a call, I can make a referral out to someone that I know who's qualified and able to take on those different opportunities.
In our last episode, you talked about, maybe you being hired or being appointed to a board was checking a box or tokenism. Do you think that's still a factor, or are businesses and organizations looking to bring Indigenous people on board for more important and legitimate and authentic reasons?
I think the quick answer is both. I think there's been quotas put in place to try to move things along. I believe what we measure, if we don't measure something, it's not going to be achieved. And so in some ways, when different industries have required certain quotas of so many Indigenous people in certain roles or so many women in certain roles, for example, it's allowed them to track where they were at and where they needed to get. That most would agree that looking at quotas is not the best way to do it. And so authentic reconciliation certainly looks different. I know a lot of organizations that believe that they want an Indigenous worldview. They want to understand that perspective and that voice and do it in an authentic way, but it's complicated. We're on this reconciliation journey and we're moving ahead as best as we can. And I feel that it's important to not sort of chastise those that are maybe not getting it quite right. It's more important to start and to humbly sort of continue forward and acknowledge that we'll probably make a few mistakes along the way, but we're starting, we're on the journey, and we're going to continue getting better as we go.
That's such a generous and thoughtful way of looking at it. Getting started is so important, even if it's not exactly the way, you would have drawn it up. How do you feel about the way it's going? Are you feeling good about reconciliation in terms of what that means in the business world? Or is it kind of one step forward, two steps back? Or how are you finding it?
All of that. I think it's complex. We know that the Truth and Reconciliation, the actions that was put out very thoughtfully by the Commission, we haven't made enough progress on some of those and some of those things in some of those areas. So overall, I think the progress has maybe been disappointing in some ways. However, I think there's bright lights that are there. And there's work that I would rather focus on the work that I'm aware of that's going the right way for the right reason, and really champion and get behind that and see that as the model and the way forward. And that's how I feel about the program that CPA is leading.
Well, I know you're currently working on a really interesting project called the Indigenous Learners in Accounting Initiative. And that's operating here in Alberta. I think it's just in Alberta. Can you tell us about that project and what your team there is working to achieve?
Yes, and so that initiative was started by AFOA Alberta, which is the Aboriginal Financial Officers Association, and CPA Western School of Business. So it's an initiative that's supported by the Western CPA bodies, so BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, actually. And what's really exciting about the initiative is it's research-based. And so the question was raised, why are there so few Indigenous CPAs? Because there's so few. There's way fewer than the market needs. And so Athabasca University and CPA Canada sort of led this research project, and it's called Mitigating the Challenges and Barriers to the Accounting Profession Facing Indigenous Peoples. And what the research focused on was understanding what the barriers were and what we could do to mitigate those barriers. And why that's important to this initiative is that's what the sort of the starting place was for the programmatic design of the initiative itself. And so all the way through, we continue to come back to, what are the barriers that are being faced, and how does our work and the redesign of this initiative continue to remove, reduce, eliminate as many of those barriers as we can.
So do the findings of this research and the work you're doing, can they be applied to other careers besides accounting? Like, are these barriers common to other businesses, other career paths?
Absolutely. A lot of them are. And there's been interest from other professions in what we're doing here with CPA and how it's moving forward. It's getting a lot of interest and attraction. We believe it's the world first that's initiative being done this way. And some of the barriers are as simple as internet in some communities. When so much of learning now and education systems are online, how do you participate if you don't have internet in your community? When you have to download the resources and you don't have enough bandwidth to do that, how do you participate? Some of the other barriers are more complex. When you perhaps are in a family situation where you're maybe a sole parent to multiple different children, how do you participate? How are you able to, without those childcare resources in place, able to move forward with this kind of education? Then there's some barriers that are incredibly complex, which is systemic racism, which exists in a lot of education institutions. And how do we look at reducing some of those barriers? And so the work has focused on redeveloping the CPA modules that are required for the articling process and sort of looking at the modules kind of one by one. We have an inaugural cohort of students who started in the program, and we're working on staying sort of in front of that group. So the hope is that they continue in the program the whole way through, and we're continuing to learn through the feedback that we're receiving and the great input that the group has. And so part of it is through program design, and the other part of it is actually looking at the cases themselves. Cases are written from a non-Indigenous worldview. And so in my own experience, starting the articling process how many years ago and seeing, all of these manufacturing companies in Toronto or in more Eastern Canada, I could not relate to what this was or what this meant. I had never seen anything like that. And so we're looking at redeveloping the cases from an Indigenous context and with Indigenous content. So they're relatable.
What do you mean by case, just for our listeners?
Yeah, so the cases, most of or a lot of the learning in the CPA articling process is done through cases. So you would read like a story about a certain business situation, and then you would have certain competencies that you were looking at developing through the different kind of learning outcomes that would come through those cases themselves. And so some of the stories that are being redeveloped and integrated through these cases are actual Indigenous characters living in different communities in different situations. And important maybe to clarify as well, I continue to say Indigenous, but the program has subject matter experts from First Nations communities, Métis communities, and Inuit communities that are representing their own perspective, because there's not a pan sort of Indigenous perspective out there. There's very unique three groups underneath that we need to be making sure are reflected.
That's a really good point, yeah. So through your involvement in this project or in this initiative, has there been anything you've seen or learned that has surprised you? Or is it pretty much what you expected you would find?
I think something that was interesting that I maybe didn't understand before but can appreciate in a different way now is the importance of learning families We talk as a design principle about how the learning families are so important and having the community that people are learning within and how important that is to the program. When I think about my own articling experience, I felt so alone. I felt lost. I really felt isolated, different. And maybe at the moment, at that time, I wouldn't have realized that was what was going on either. But thinking back to that period of my life, it was challenging. The community that we've been able to create through the Indigenous Learners Initiative with these learning families is incredibly powerful. These students or learners are connecting with each other even outside of the course and the cohorts themselves because they've built these connections with each other, and they'll become these young CPA professionals that have that peer group that they can rely on. You know, being able to see yourself in others and having that connection is so important.
Yeah, that's a really powerful force when you don't feel alone and you've got those connections, and they could maintain those connections through their entire careers, you know?
Absolutely.
Based on what you've seen and experienced with this project and your other work, is there any advice you would give to Indigenous Albertans seeking careers in business or entrepreneurship?
When I think about advice, I think about start now, get curious. There is so much out there, so much great work that's being done in the right way for the right reasons, I believe. I think CPA is an incredible career that opens so many doors. I would credit having my CPA designation to contributing to, directly or indirectly, every success I've had professionally. Absolutely. It's also really, it's tricky. It's tough. But being an expert and getting to that level is so worth it. I can't think of anything more important to dedicate yourself to if you'd like to be able to contribute in that way to business. And so having the support in place, being ready to do it, to really dig in and dig all in so that you can benefit from not only the education, but the experience that it is to go through that process is a big part of the value too.
What was the hardest part for you about earning your CPA designation? The 20-hour days or during tax time? Or
Well, and things are evolving now where I think what used to be is not what is anymore. For me, I'm not sure if I could pinpoint one specific tricky thing, but with the maybe wisdom I have now looking back, I think about how I would have valued from prioritizing my physical and mental health in a different way. I really threw myself all into the articling process and to working hard, long hours. And I think now, had I had prioritized eating healthier, getting better sleep, maybe exercising more regularly and some of those things, what that would have meant for what I would have been able to accomplish. Because I think it would have made me stronger and happier and healthier when I got to the end.
That's actually really good advice for people. And so often people learn those things, a little later than would have been optimal. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions on how Alberta educational institutions, Alberta businesses, and community organizations can support Indigenous Albertans seeking educational and career success?
The work that we're doing with CPA, I think, is a model because it's Indigenous-led. I think for non-Indigenous folks or institutions or businesses or communities that are looking to get involved, there's not an Indigenous problem that needs to be fixed. Reconciliation is really about learning and unlearning and finding a way forward together. And the Indigenous people and voices need to be in the room and need to be leading the change that needs to happen. And it's not, sometimes I hear it said as, changing Indigenous people. It's changing business. It's changing the institutions themselves. And so advice around having an openness, coming to the table with the awareness that things that we're comfortable with now, processes, systems, ways of life, are not the ways of life of everyone. And there's a lot that could be learned by incorporating those Indigenous worldviews into some of these institutions. And so reconciliation is important because it's foundationally the right thing to do, no doubt. And there's actual results to be tied to improve business outcomes with more Indigenous people in some of those roles and in some of those spaces. And so I could go on about advice all day, but I think starting the conversation, finding the right people to have that conversation with, and there's many that are very willing to make the introductions. And so some people have reached out and almost cold called me and said, we'd like to start, or we're not sure. I'm always willing to have the conversation, make the connection, and really value the spirit in which people come forward with wanting to do the right thing in the right way, and Indigenous people can help guide that way.
Can you think of a specific, maybe hypothetical example of what, say, a large university could do to achieve that, of integrating in the Indigenous spirit or Indigenous learnings into how they operate? Like, what kinds of things could they do? Any specific examples you can think of?
Part of the Indigenous Learners Initiative that CPA is leading is about the change that institutions need to make. And some of the barriers actually come from the way in which the institutions operate and function. And so I think the learnings are in that research report, and that would be a place to start because it's really, it's fact-based and it's well-researched and well-understood.
That's a great tip. I think everyone should have a look at that. I think that pretty well covers everything we want to talk about today, Maureen. Any final thoughts on our conversation today and last time?
Final thoughts, just thank you for asking me to be here today. It's an interesting position to be in for me as a member of the CPA Alberta board and as a contributor to the Indigenous Learners Initiative. And I do all of that because I'm really, really passionate about the profession and the community that we're creating. So I think there's value in sort of leaving us with, if there's anyone that's listening to this that is curious about how they might get involved, would be so open to those conversations and making those connections, because I think there's a groundswell that's starting here that's very, very exciting. And there's so much that's yet to come that I think is going to transform our profession.
Wow. That's a great place to end it, I think, Maureen. So thank you for speaking so openly and authentically about yourself and for sharing your insights with our audience. You've given all of us so much to remember and to think about. So thank you for being here, and thank you for your contributions to the fabric of life in our province.
Thank you.
The Uncommon Sense podcast is presented by the CPA Education Foundation and funded by the Heshie CPA Knowledge Center. The Knowledge Center was created through a generous donation to the CPA Education Foundation by the late Brian Heshie. Brian was a distinguished Albertan, business leader, CPA, educator, and community builder. His generosity and commitment to education underpinned his good works across Alberta throughout his lifetime. We would like to acknowledge that the CPA Education Foundation offices are situated on the traditional Treaty 6 and Treaty 7 territories and Métis Nation homeland. The Foundation acknowledges that we reside on traditional and ancestral territories of many Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Their histories and culture influence our community to this day. The CPA Education Foundation is committed to helping build a province where Indigenous people and their voices and experiences are heard, valued, respected, and celebrated. Technical and recording services for this podcast provided by Wolf Willow Studios in Edmonton. If you enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to like, subscribe, and tell your friends about us. If you have any comments on the podcast, write to us at cpaef@cpaalberta.ca. To learn more about the CPA Education Foundation and the Heshie CPA Knowledge Center, visit cpaalberta.ca/foundation. Thanks for listening.